Discovering Alabama is a production of the Alabama Museum of Natural History.
Welcome to one of the most beautiful spots in all of our beautiful state. I'm here at the easternmost point of the Fort Morgan Peninsula. Right over here is the Grand Ole Fort that stood guard over these waters for over 200 years. Just beyond the fort is one of the last remaining examples of a maritime forest to be found growing on the Alabama coastline. And just beyond that, we find examples of a new type of growth that may threaten to overtake what many of us love most about our beautiful state. Hi, I'm Doug Phillips. Join me for a look at the past, present, and future of Fort Morgan, and at how it may reflect on the past, present, and future of Alabama. This program is about a land unknown to many people, a land that in many ways has escaped the hustle and bustle of modern civilization, a place with bountiful backcountry, forests, streams, and wildlife more diverse than can be found in much of the inhabited world. Come along with me as we explore the natural wonders of this land. Come along as we discover Alabama. Welcome to Discovering Alabama, and welcome to Fort Morgan. In many ways, Fort Morgan is representative of the state itself. Here on this tiny spit of land, you can find unrivaled beauty. We find a paradise for sportsmen. We find a wealth of natural resources. Here we can discover a great array of life. And here at Fort Morgan, we can uncover a history of our state and our nation. It was in this area that Europeans probably got their first glimpse of Alabama. Mobile Bay is flanked to the east by Fort Morgan and about 3 miles to the west by Dauphin Island. From Mobile Bay, sailors could proceed up to the Mobile-Tensaw Delta, and from there deep into Indian Territory by Alabama's intricate river systems. After the War of 1812, the young United States of America realized the need for more secure coastal fortifications, and work began on Fort Morgan. The star shape enabled defenders to bring a high concentration of artillery fire on an approaching enemy fleet. As important as the fort was in the early history of the United States, it's probably best known for the role it played in the war between the states.
The federal troops always thought that they needed to take this fort and to eventually take Mobile. A large number of ships were marshaled out in the Gulf here. They brought in some ironclads to beef up the fleet, and in early August of 1864, they began to come into the bay.
And in those days, mines were known as torpedoes. Union Admiral David Farragut planned to run his ships through the narrow channel. One of the first ships to attempt the run struck a torpedo and sank within minutes. When other of Farragut's ships hesitated, he shouted his legendary order, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead."
Having taken the bay as he had, then he was free to do as the British had done so many years before, to land his ships over around Navy Cove, disembark a large number of men and cannon, bring them into place, and begin a bombardment on the fort. And it eventually, in several days, he was able to dismount most of the guns, and eventually the fort was forced to surrender.
With the vast improvements in artillery during the Civil War, old brick and mortar fortresses like Fort Morgan became obsolete. However, during World Wars I and II, the old fort found new purpose. During World War I, the fort was used as a training base for artillerymen. And during most of World War II, the fort was reactivated and garrisoned. After World War II, after more than 100 years of service in defense of the nation, Fort Morgan was turned over to the state of Alabama for preservation as a historic site, and is today administered by the Alabama Historical Commission. Right now, students and archaeologists are working to uncover the history of human presence and use of this guardian of Mobile Bay. It is the human history here that the Alabama Museum of Natural History's annual museum expedition hopes to unearth. This year, the expedition is working at Fort Morgan in cooperation with the Alabama Historical Commission. Since 1979, the museum expedition has given Alabamians the opportunity to actively participate in the study of their state.
Well, one thing that they're doing here is that they're working with an archaeologist or a scientist, and sometimes we do paleontology, but this year we are doing archaeology. So the science that they're doing is real. This isn't pretend, it's not sandbox. They are uncovering information that has not been seen in 135 years. They're doing it scientifically, they're collecting it, they're bagging it, they're identifying it, right along with the scientists and the archaeologists here on site.
Yes, this is serious archaeology. This is the first large-scale archaeological project that's ever been conducted here. There have been several small investigations and certain digs in the 1950s and things of that nature, but this is the first large-scale project that we know of here.
This is the third week of the expedition, and this is my second week out here.
Okay, well, let's go in and take a close look. Okay. Well, this looks interesting. Tell me what's interesting.
Well, this is a trench that starts outside where we think the Citadel wall was, and it goes all the way, it cuts across through to the inside, where the brick along there is the inner courtyard.
How about that? How about that? Well, what's the most fun part?
The most fun part for me, well, it's just digging and getting to see everything. Certainly, the artifacts are really interesting when you get to find one. I keep coming out here because I enjoy knowing how they do this, how they find everything, and how they know where to look, and the methodology of finding everything out here, and looking for different artifacts and different sites and whatnot.
Well, what's the roughest part?
The roughest part is probably sifting. Nobody likes that out here.
All right, so this is the sifting.
Yeah.
Tell me what's happening here.
Once you get a bucket full of dirt from out in the trench or wherever you happen to be working, you and your partner come over together and sift through the dirt to see if you find any artifacts or any...
That's where the goodies are revealed. Then.
Yeah, yeah. Well, sometimes you can find them when you're digging out there, but most of the time you'll see them when you're sifting.
Okay, great, great. All right, let's go see what else we can find. Jennifer, when you find some artifacts, what's the next step?
Well, you take everything that you sift out of there, even just the rocks and broken pieces of brick, and take them over into the lab.
Okay, well, let's go take a look. Hey!
Hey.
When they bring the artifacts in,
Right.
what's your role here? What do you do with them at this point?
Well, they bring the artifacts in, and then we take them to the water screen, and we water screen and wash them off a little bit. We set them out in the sun to dry. And then after they're dried out in the sun, we bring them back in here, and the participants that are working in the lab, they sort it by different types of stuff like brick and mortar and shell and metal and all kinds of stuff. And then after they sort it, then we weigh the brick and the mortar and shell. And then the metal and lithics and other stuff are sorted and bagged.
Oh, and what do we have up here?
This is some of the stuff that we found in the past 2 weeks. This is some of the ceramics in here, and this is blue transferware. And we just found this today, the thermometer.
Thermometer?
Yeah, that we found today.
Did they have coals back then? Do you know?
Probably.
How about that?
And then we found the pipe, parts of a pipe, the stem, and the little the bowl fragments and then the actual bowl you can see here. And yesterday we found a piece of what we think is a chandelier.
A chandelier,
And-
that it here?
Mhm.
Gosh, that is. People are interested in shot. Did you find some shot? Some cannon shot?
Yeah, the canister shots. Then we found this is a kind of distorted one that the size didn't line up that great.
And there's an actual,
Yeah, it's a mini ball. Everybody calls it a mini ball, but actually it's like a Monet.
and this would be from what period?
Civil
Civil
I
War
think.
period.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right.
And then we found a few buttons, and this one it was a musket ball. And then after, I don't know if it was used or not, but they used it as a sinker for like a fishing line.
Oh,
So-
yeah, for a big fish.
Yeah. So,
On the bottom.
and then we found in the first layer, which we were kind of expecting to find, it was mixed, but we found some prehistoric pottery.
Oh, boy.
So, and then an infantry button that we found a few days ago.
With all these wonderful things you found, did you find any artifacts that date back to the early British and Spanish days when the fort was established?
No, not right now. We're in the vicinity, but we're still looking for the information.
Ah, okay. Thanks. Archaeology is a dirty business, but no one here seems to mind.
It really clears my head, and you're so focused on what you're doing, and if you love history, and you're literally feeling history. Right before lunch, I found a thermometer right here, and we think it's the Civil War era. This is the wall into the citadel that burned during the Battle of Mobile Bay, and of course, you know, that was Farragut and down the torpedoes and stuff I've read about all my life, and here a fellow may have been using that thermometer the day before the Farragut burned the place down, so it's just very literal.
Digging into the history of Alabama has an impact on all of the participants of the museum expeditions. But perhaps the greatest influence is on the young people. Many come back year after year. Brian, this year's expedition leader, has been joining the annual expedition since he was a youngster.
But this is a unique project, and we're now in our third week, or getting ready to start our third week, and a lot of has been accomplished so far, and we're looking forward to a lot more interesting discoveries.
And we know there's no other program like that across the United States that allows students, whether they're young or old, to actually get down and do the science with the people that are in charge.
As impressive as the human history of Fort Morgan is, there's a wildlife history here that's every bit as amazing.
I know of no place in Alabama that's more special to the birds than this, more important to the birds than this. In a normal year, these neotropical migrant birds that we study, and neotropical migrant birds simply means a class of birds that spends their winter in the tropics in Mexico, Central America, and even South America. And each spring, these birds will come into the U.S., and most will migrate across the Gulf of Mexico. It's an arduous journey at best. Normal flight times for them, they're airborne probably 18 to 22 hours. Then this habitat, this Fort Morgan Peninsula, becomes first landfall for these birds. And many of these birds would not make it past this point. So this is a very special place. It's the premier birding spot for those that enjoy the recreation of birding. But more than that, it's critical to the lives of these migrant birds.
All of the members of the group studying these tiny travelers are volunteers, and all are highly trained. Back at the headquarters tent, the birds are examined and the data are recorded into a computer. These data are reported to the Bird Banding Laboratory in Maryland, whose parent organization is the National Geological Survey. The data are then available for any researcher. Before the birds are released, they are banded. Every band carries a number unique to a specific bird. These researchers have often noted the same bird returning to Fort Morgan year after year after year. The capture, study, and release of these little critters is an educational experience for Gulf Shores Elementary School and for any other visitor who happens along.
You bring students out here in the woods with all these sounds going on, a beautiful day like today, Now, they're learning about migration on a completely different level, and they will know so much more about migration as opposed to those who are sitting in class learning about charts.
It's an educational experience. We've studied quite a bit about the birds and their habitats, and my major objective for my class this year was to give them the opportunity to see the habitat and the environment that the birds live in, so we could study some of the elements that affect their environment so we can help with that as we grow older.
All of it.
For thousands of years before the first Canadian ever motorhomed his way to the winter warmth of the Fort Morgan Peninsula, these little creatures have rested here to renew their strength for the arduous journey across the Gulf of Mexico.
She's really full.
In the spring, the birds come back to these shores, back to this maritime forest, on their journey back to their summertime homes. These spring and autumn migrations have been going on for longer than we can imagine. For the past several centuries, these tiny travelers have been sharing the peninsula with humans. There are still a few wild parts of Fort Morgan Peninsula where wildlife can dwell without coming into conflict with condos. One of the best is the Bon Secours Wildlife Refuge.
Well, if you look at the Alabama coastline, this refuge constitutes probably one of the last few undeveloped tracts of land along the Alabama coast. And as you drive down 180 or 182, you see it's just completely lined with condominiums and homes and restaurants and all kinds of development. And as things develop, we are losing many things, not just wildlife species like Alabama beach mice, which obviously rely on the coast or the dunes, but it's messing up even the way the sand acts. You know, we're losing beaches as a result of that and all the things that are dependent upon the beaches. So probably our number one problem at this site is development and habitat loss.
On the Fort Morgan Peninsula today, many of the last native wildlands are changing rapidly. The Fort Morgan Peninsula is under the incredible pressure of human growth, which has dramatically accelerated in recent years. And while visitors to the area may still find plenty to see, longtime residents have a different perspective.
I've been living here for 94 years. I was born and reared just a short distance from the church here, just down the way, just a little bit. There's been a vast change in it. You just don't see it like you used to. You could see birds. There was all kinds of birds in here. There was all kind of animals. There was wildcats. There was raccoons and possums. And the most times that you ever see anything like that, they're killed on the highway.
What we're concerned about is turning this area into another Orange Beach. Alabama only has 32 miles of coast. There is no more. And this is the most fragile part of it. This is a long, narrow peninsula. There's just not much here. Have a hurricane. One car wreck keeps everybody from leaving here. One tree across the road. There's just not that much land left that is not wetlands or dunes. And we seem to understand in general that it's not best to destroy those wetlands and dunes, but they keep being destroyed more and more every day.
First of all, contrary to what you might read, there's no move down here to put a blockade up to keep people from coming to the Fort Morgan area. What the residents, the full-time residents, are trying to do is try to maintain as much of the natural Fort Morgan as people remember that have come down here. And in the last 3 or 4 years, the number of buildings and things down here just blossomed, just sprung up.
This is the last few miles of Gulf Front out Fort Morgan Road. This is the last few miles or so of Gulf Front in Orange Beach, Alabama.
What is happening in Orange Beach? Well, from the perspective of someone who's been here since '82, it feels like we're trying to grow too fast. That it's more important get the money as quickly as we can instead of looking long range, you know, looking down into the future. And I know that people like to come here, and you know, it wouldn't make sense to say no, no one can come, but if we destroy the very reason that they come, then what's going to happen?
It wasn't that long ago that this looked like this. From her perspective of 94 years in this beautiful spot of Alabama, what does Miss Galloway see for the future, for us and our children?
I feel sorry for the young people, for grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. I've even got a great-great-granddaughter. And I feel for them because I can see the changes, and I know in my own mind in time to come, if the Lord don't come, if he don't take a hand in it, then they ain't no telling what it'll wind up with.
Not so long ago, this historic fort itself was being pursued by developers. Fortunately, folks from around Alabama and folks from around the nation rallied to defend Fort Morgan with letters to the governor. How does it happen? How does our very history and heritage come up for the highest bidder?
I don't believe I can honestly answer that. It seems to me like it's a conspiracy without any players. It has no bottom line. Development is going to take place through hook or crook. Early on in my career down here, I went to a seminar in Fairhope on zoning, and they had one of the main speakers was a lawyer from Delaware, and he talked about zoning and how to get around. And he would read a zoning ordinance, and now this is the way around this. This is the way around that. And I think there's a way around everything.
Money talks. If I'm coming to you to build a $200 million development in your district, you're probably going to do the courtesy of listening to me. If I'm coming to you to complain, you've heard a lot of complaints, and you probably don't really relish hearing any more complaints.
Should the voice of money be the only voice heard as decisions are made for the future of this area? Or will we hear the call of our history? Will we listen to the songs of our natural surroundings? Will our heritage be heard? And how do the questions we face here among the relatively few square miles of the Fort Morgan Peninsula reflect the questions we face across the whole state of Alabama? Is this what we want? Or is this what we want? It's been many hundreds of years since the European explorers arrived at Alabama's Gulf Coast. When they came ashore back then, they found a setting that's totally wild, probably much like this spot here. This is a stretch of the Fort Morgan Peninsula that remains intact today, where you can still get a sense of the intrigue, the adventure that the explorers must have felt. These native surroundings are an important part of the history of our nation, of the heritage of our state. How much of this wonderful heritage will remain for the future?
This program is supported by grants from the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, State Lands Division, the Alabama Wildlife Federation, working for wildlife since 1935, and Legacy, Partners in Environmental Education.